about insects, pollinators, but also more broadly all insects. I've been strangely obsessed by insects all my life, really. I can't explain why. Just from an early age, when I was 5 or 6 years old, I started collecting grasshoppers and caterpillars and any other things I could find, and trying to keep them alive and rear them up, and the caterpillars, if I didn't kill them, would eventually turn into butterflies and moths, and I just was completely hooked and have been ever since. And I guess I've been lucky that I've managed to make a career out of my childhood hobby, and people pay me to chase around after insects, which is very cool as far as I'm concerned. This is my youngest son, Seth, with his pet cockchafer, Colin. Seth is still in his bug phase. I hope he never grows out of it. I think actually it's not unusual if kids get half a chance. They love creepy crawlies, insects, any kind of animal, if they can get close to it and interact with it and so on. But sadly, many kids don't get that opportunity. And one way or another, it seems to me that most teenagers and adults are frightened of insects. Their first reaction when anything flies near them is to flap. They try and kill it. They think it's going to sting them, bite them, do something, I don't know, which is ridiculous, really, because the insect is very, very small compared to us. But anyway, I thought that sort of common attitude is beautifully encapsulated in this picture. You can just see University of South Wales to blame. I don't know who created this giant red and white warning sign. Flying insects, run for your lives. What kind of message does that send to people? You know, are we supposed telling them they should be frightened of anything that flies? It was flying ants was what they were warning people about, which are completely harmless. Bizarre. Anyway, let me just give you a bit of information about insects. Insects have been around for about 480 million years. Which makes them twice as old as the oldest dinosaurs. It's a really, really long time. It doesn't mean much, those kind of numbers. But anyway, because they've been here so long, they've speciated and diversified into this just incredible array of different creatures. We've named about 1.1 million species of insect so far, which means they make up about 70% of all known species on our planet. But it's estimated that there may be another 3, 4, 5 million species that we haven't even discovered yet, which is mind-boggling. Just to imagine what beasties are out there that we haven't yet set eyes on. How exciting is that? It makes me slightly wonder why we spend so much time and money going out into space and whatever when we haven't really properly explored our own planet yet. Anyway, so insects have been around a very long time. They make up the bulk of life on Earth. They've survived the apocalypses that wiped out many other creatures. They survived the dinosaurs when the meteor struck and the dinosaurs were wiped out 65 million years ago. The insects made it through. I'm sure some probably went extinct, but as a whole, plenty of them survived. But today they are in decline, very largely. And I just wanted to show you an example. This is one of my favourite insects. This is the shrill carder bumblebee, which is it's a beautiful little creature. It's a small bumblebee, and it has a particularly high-pitched buzz, which is why it's called the shrill carder. And anyway, you can see from the map, that shows you where it was found historically, pre-1960. It was pretty widespread in the southern half of Britain. Not so common this far north, but they were around. But as time went on, this bee disappeared, and by 2000, it was down to about 6 populations. And that's roughly when I got interested in trying to understand why bumblebees in particular were declining. And at the time I was based at Southampton University on the south coast, and I looked at the maps of this species and decided to go to Salisbury Plain to try and see them, and I spent a whole summer searching around on Salisbury Plain. I did eventually find a couple of them. They were really like a needle in a haystack. But I remember getting really excited when I finally found my first shrill carder bumblebee. But sadly, that Salisbury Plain population has gone extinct since I saw them there in 2000. And the one on the Somerset Levels just to the west seems to be about to disappear. There's down to 1 or 2 bees in the last couple of years. So this bee is disappearing before our eyes. You know, in my lifetime, it's gone from being a common insect to teetering on the edge of extinction in Britain, and many others have done likewise. And this should really worry us, because insects are really, really important. They make up the bulk of life, as I've already explained. But then they're sort of close to the bottom of the food chain. They are food for an awful lot of other organisms. Most species of bird either eat insects all the time or use insects as the main source of protein to feed to their chicks. And also, of course, bats depend on insects. Lizards, freshwater fish like trout and salmon, amphibians, they all eat insects. So if the insects are disappearing, then sadly they will disappear. And we've seen big declines in recent years of many insect specialist predators like cuckoos or spotted flycatchers or whatever. So insects are important as food, but they do tons of other things. They are involved in more or less every kind of ecological process you can think of on land or in fresh water. So they are predators of crop pests. They help to keep the numbers under control. They're recyclers of more or less every organic material you can think of: dead bodies, cow pats, tree trunks, leaves, and so on. They recycle the nutrients and return them to the soil so that more plants can grow. And what else do they do? They help keep the soil healthy. They distribute seeds. You name it, they're busy doing it. There's one thing I haven't mentioned, obviously, and it's the one thing that I think people are already familiar with. Most of this stuff, recycling and so on, most people have no idea that insects do it. But one thing they do know is that insects are important pollinators. They mistakenly often think that pollination is all done by bees. I think many people think all pollination is done by one species of bee, the honeybee, lives in a box, gives us honey, which of course is a gross oversimplification. In fact, just in the UK, it's estimated there are about 6,000 species of pollinating insect. We have no idea how many there are worldwide, but it would be hundreds of thousands, almost certainly. So it includes the bees, but also wasps, beetles, lots of species of flies, and so on and so on. And between them, they pollinate 80% of all plant species on our planet. So if we didn't have insect pollinators, the large majority of plant life would disappear, which would just have enormous consequences for the rest of life. And of course they pollinate our crops. So we've all become used to our supermarkets being replete with this amazing array of fruits and veg available 12 months of the year, often flown in from all over the place. Without insect pollinators, it wouldn't look so good. 3/4 of the crops we grow in the world wouldn't give a full harvest without insect pollinators. Some would produce something, some are partially self-fertile, so they don't always need pollinating, but they don't give a full harvest without pollination. And some plants would produce essentially nothing at all without pollination. So we'd have a real problem trying to feed everybody if we didn't have insect pollinators. There simply wouldn't be enough fruit and veg in the world for us all to have a decent diet, which is obviously cause for concern. And we really need to avoid ending up like these people, these pictures look quite pretty really, don't they? But they're taken in southwest China, and they show local people hand-pollinating their apple and pear orchards because there aren't enough pollinators left to do it, so the people pollinate their own crops. And that's just about economically viable in China, where labour is relatively cheap, and this is a high-value crop, but it's hard to imagine a European farmer, a Lincolnshire farmer, hand-pollinating his oilseed rape field, so we need to make sure that doesn't happen here. So you can make a really compelling argument, but our lives would be measurably worse off if we didn't have insects busy doing all these things. They provide essential ecosystem services, scientists often term them. And they do, and I've trotted this argument out hundreds of times. But in recent years, I've started to get doubts about it, its usefulness. It seems like a really selfish way to view the rest of nature, that we should only look after things that do something for us. We'd be worse off if we didn't have bees or whatever it might be. It seems to me that nature has an intrinsic value, and that we shouldn't just value things that do something useful for us, because, well, for two reasons. Firstly, the reason I care about bumblebees and butterflies and so on is not because they provide me with an ecosystem service. I couldn't really care less what they do. I just think they're kind of cool and beautiful and interesting, and I think they deserve a place on our planet regardless of what they're doing. And also the sort of utilitarian argument falls a bit flat for many species because they probably don't do anything all that useful. And here's an example. This is the St. Helena giant earwig. It's the biggest earwig that ever lived, 3 inches long or thereabouts, an absolute whopper. Only ever found on this little island, St. Helena in the South Atlantic. Tragically extinct. It hasn't been seen since the 1960s. We think they were eaten by rats that we accidentally introduced to the island. Now, when it went extinct, there was no kind of ecological repercussions. It wasn't providing some service that was necessary. It just quietly disappeared. But it seems to me the world is a sadder place for not having a giant earwig, even though none of us were ever going to go there and see it. And likewise, there are probably millions of other species quietly doing their own thing, which has no implications for us at all. But surely they deserve to live. They deserve a place to live. I kind of think, as well as human rights, we should have, rights of species to exist. Anyway, I'm in danger of rambling on. So I think we should look after these things better. I hope you agree with me. You wouldn't be here otherwise, I guess. So for the rest of my talk today, I'm going to talk about 3 broad areas where I think we need to do something, or could do something that would really help. I'm going to start off very briefly talking about farming, which is a big, complicated subject, and I'm not going to do it justice at all. It really needs a separate talk, probably from somebody else. But anyway, and then I'll talk a little bit about rewilding, and then I'm going to spend most of my time talking about what we can do in our gardens, which you could call urban rewilding if you wanted to. So anyway, start off with, let's look at farming. So, for the last 100 years or so, we've gone down this route of industrialized farming, where fields have got bigger, chemical inputs have become greater almost every year. We now use lots of fertilizers, lots of pesticides to grow huge monocultures of crops. And I think many people think this is the only way we can feed the world. Obviously the human population has grown a lot and is going to keep growing to at least 10 billion, possibly quite a lot more than that, we don't know. And we need to feed everybody, obviously, that's vital. And therefore the argument goes, we need industrialized, huge-scale agriculture. I think there's a flaw in that argument because I don't think this is sustainable in the long term. It's doing terrible damage to the environment in a number of different ways. It is the biggest driver of biodiversity loss. The way farming has intensified has pretty much eradicated. Modern farming doesn't really leave much space at all for most wildlife. And farmland is often, not always, but very often staggeringly lacking in biodiversity compared to what it would have been in previous decades. And so it's undermining its own basis. It's wiping out the pollinators that it needs to pollinate the crops. It's wiping out the organisms that would keep the soil healthy, and it's wiping out the things that would help to control the pests and so on. So I don't think it's sustainable in that sense, but there are other problems too. The United Nations recently published a report which shows that about 40% of all the world's soils are badly degraded. and this is an ongoing process, it's getting worse every year. What are future generations going to grow their food in if we don't leave them any soil? That seems like a fundamental failure on our part. So we really need to do something about that. And also, farming and food production and processing is responsible for about 35% of all greenhouse gas emissions. We all know that we need to reduce those, although our current government doesn't seem so keen right now. But anyway, sorry, don't want to go into politics. So I don't think we can carry on down this route forever. If we do, I think there's a real danger people will starve because the crops won't be pollinated, there won't be any soil for them to grow in, and the climate will be wrecked. So we need to do something different. What can we do? Well, I think the best thing is to sort of step back and think, what would the perfect food system provide? What is it we want? So we need to provide enough food, and ideally enough of the right kinds of food to feed everyone a healthy diet, which is something actually the current system fails to do. So we currently massively overproduce grains and oils at a global scale and hugely underproduce fruits and vegetables. So there aren't enough fruit and veg in the world for everyone to have 5 a day. But there's tons and tons, broadly in terms of calories, we grow about 3 times as much food as we need to feed everyone. But then we waste about 1/3 of it, and we feed 1/3 of it to livestock rather than to people. So the whole system is very inefficient, and it means we end up eating way too much grain and oil, which is driving an obesity epidemic. And anyway, I'm getting diverted from the central point here, which is that what we're doing at present isn't great. So anyway, we need to produce a healthy diet. We need to look after the soil so that future generations have something to grow their food in. And I think broadly, the only way to farm sustainably is to try to work with natural ecosystems, with nature, to support healthy populations of predators to control the crop pests rather than relying on endlessly spraying more and more pesticides to do the job. And so really, we need to find a way of farming with much reduced chemical inputs. Ideally, no chemical inputs, which all sounds like quite a... Can we really do that and still feed everybody? Well, I think we can. There are some really interesting things going on in the world of farming today, and I haven't got time at all to really go into them. But there are lots of different farmers trying to farm, it's often called regeneratively, but there are strikingly different approaches to this. I've included a few here. Things like agroforestry, which involves growing perennial crops, shrubs and trees, often in lines across what were formerly large monoculture fields to hold the soil together, to shelter the crop, to provide home for biodiversity and so on. Biodynamic farming is a bit of a favourite of mine, and I'm surprised to find myself saying that because I used to think it was completely bonkers. But I don't know if any of you are familiar with biodynamic farming. They has aspects of witchcraft. They make kind of magic potions that they sprinkle on the crops, and they plant by the moon and so on. But actually, I shouldn't poke fun at them, because if you go to a biodynamic farm, and there's one quite close to where I live in West Sussex, the soil is rich and black and really healthy and full of worms, and there are loads of bees and butterflies and lots of bird song. It's full of life. They grow this huge diversity of crops, fruits and vegetables, and they've got livestock to provide the dung to fertilise the crops. They don't use any pesticides at all. And if you look at the yield they produce, it compares really favourably with a conventional farm. So they're doing something right, and it seems to me that we should be investigating and investing far more money in research and development into these kinds of approaches to farming compared to the conventional ever driving for more inputs and higher yields, which is what we've done for the last 60 years and which has got us into the mess we're in, I think. Anyway, you'll probably find that a totally unsatisfactory treatment of farming, but it'll have to do for tonight. The second thing I wanted to talk about a little bit was rewilding, which I think is a really exciting development that's emerged in recent years. It's not everyone's cup of tea. It seems to be deeply offensive as a concept to some people, and I can't really get my head around why some people are so against it. Anyway, let me tell you what I think it is, and see what you think. So I first heard of rewilding in the context of Yellowstone National Park. It's a famous example. And I'll give you the very abbreviated story of what happened at Yellowstone. So it's a huge national park in the United States. It was completely infested with what they call elk, which are basically red deer. Because they'd hunted wolves to extinction hundreds of years ago, so the elk had no predators. And so there were too many of them, they were overgrazing, the soil was eroding because there were no plants to hold it together, the trees couldn't regenerate because any sapling just got eaten. So the whole place was a disaster, very low in biodiversity. And so they took the decision to reintroduce some wolves. And so the story goes, it had a really profound positive impact, a kind of cascade of effects. Not because the elk population was much reduced, because they only introduced something like a dozen wolves to this enormous national park, but it changed the behaviour of the elk, knowing there were wolves around. They tended to herd together, they tended to stay in the open spaces, they avoided going into steep-sided river valleys in particular because they could get trapped there. And so trees started to regenerate along the rivers, which provided food for beavers, and the beaver population increased and created lots more dams, which provided more wildlife habitat. And there's more to it, and if you want to know the full story, there's a George Monbiot YouTube video you can find where he goes into more detail. But it's quite cool, and it seems to be a really nice example where restoring an important missing species had really important, profound ecological benefits for the whole ecosystem. From a UK perspective, things are a bit different. So, I was taught at university that prior to man's arrival in Western Europe, it was dense forest, the primordial forest. It was pretty much oak trees and whatnot, with hardly any break in the forest cover at all. And I always wondered, I remember talking to my tutor at college about this and pondering, was it really like that? Because where did all the sun-loving animals live? And plants, lots of our plants will only grow in the open. They'll never survive in a dense forest. Lots of our butterflies, something like, say, the Adonis blue butterfly, it thrives in completely open, sunny habitats. It wouldn't last 5 minutes in a woodland. So was it really, or was this dense woodland? And in recent years, most ecologists have come around to a slightly different view of what it looked like. They've realised that we don't have large herbivores anymore, but we're used to. And maybe they maintained a much more open habitat than we see today. Today, if you leave a piece of land, it will eventually turn into dense woodland. But in the historical past, when there were giant aurochs wandering around, which is like huge ancestors of cows and ponies and red deer and elk and wild boar and everything, causing disturbance, browsing trees, knocking them over and so on, maybe it was much more open, more like a sort of a patchwork of forests and open meadows, or perhaps something more like a savanna than we previously imagined, which kind of makes some sense. And so that idea inspired the thought that we should put back some of the missing big herbivores, and that might then naturally support more biodiversity than we could otherwise see. There's a really nice, well-known rewilding project close to where I live, which is the Knepp Estate in West Sussex, which is 3,500 acres of what was formerly intensive farmland, but it's on a heavy clay soil, which isn't very fertile. So the yields were really low, and despite lots of farm subsidies, they were making a loss and slowly going broke. So 20 years ago, they decided to do something different. They put a ring fence around the outside, and they released some old breed longhorn cattle that can look after themselves all winter outside. They released Tamworth pigs as a surrogate for wild boar. They put in some Exmoor ponies. And there were already deer. They added red deer that were missing. And then the idea is, as far as possible, to step back and let it do its own thing. They do still have to cull the animals, because there is no wolf, there are no bears, there are no lynx, there are no predators. Now, if it were down to me, I'd be really happy to introduce wolves to Sussex. I think it'd be a brilliant idea. I know it's not going to go down very well with everybody, but if you're sitting there thinking this is crazy talk, just reflect on the fact that every European country now has wild wolves. Even the Netherlands has wild wolves, and the Netherlands is tiny and really intensively farmed and much more densely populated with humans than Britain is. Surely we could squeeze in a few wolves in the quieter parts of Britain, and maybe a bear or two. Wouldn't that be good? Anyway, unfortunately that isn't yet an option at NEP, but they have added these things, beavers, a year or so ago, and before that the storks they reintroduced. And it's really exciting. The storks are breeding very happily. There are dozens of nests on the treetops, and I defy anyone to go to NEP in the spring. I highly recommend you do. Go and walk around, and you will hear turtle doves cooing in the distance. They make this lovely purring noise. We never hear turtle doves anymore in Britain. They're almost extinct. You'll hear cuckoos, which in the lowlands of England you hardly ever hear anymore, but there are loads of them at NEP. You'll hear nightingales singing even in the daytime. There are so many of them. They've got the second biggest nightingale population in Britain. From a standing start, they didn't have any nightingales when they started this 20 years ago. And from an insect point of view, we've done bee surveys and we've found about 90 species so far. They've got the biggest population of purple emperor butterflies in Britain. Again, they didn't have purple emperor butterflies 20 years ago. And this year, really excitingly, the large tortoiseshell turned up. Now, the large tortoiseshell is supposed to be extinct. Nobody seems to know where it came from. I'm a bit suspicious that somebody snuck them in. Who knows? Or maybe it was natural. I don't suppose we'll ever know. But nonetheless, really exciting to see there's so much life there. And so it seems to me, we can't obviously rewild everywhere. We need to grow food. But on the least productive land, that doesn't produce much food and where farming is only viable with lots of taxpayers' subsidies, it seems to me we should give farmers the option, if they want to do something different, to encourage biodiversity, to encourage carbon capture, to encourage tourism and recreational opportunities, because millions of people go to NEP every year to enjoy all of this. And it seems to me that sacrificing the small amount of food they were producing before is not such a big price to pay to look after nature in this way. Okay, third and final topic, gardening, garden wilding, if you like. This is something that I think is really exciting. You know, lots of these conservation issues are really doom and gloom. You know, climate change, rainforests being burnt down, all the horrible things going on in the world, ice caps melting and so on. And we all feel so frustrated and angry and helpless. But with insects, it's different because they live all around us. They're in our gardens, they're in local parks. We can all get involved in doing something. And most of them haven't yet gone extinct and can recover really quickly if you just provide them with some of the right conditions, a bit of habitat, a bit of peace. And there are 22 million private gardens in the UK. They cover collectively an area of about 400,000 hectares, which is not bigger than the area of national parks, as Megan McCubin said on Springwatch, but it is bigger than the area of all of our nature reserves. It's a big bit of land if you were to put it all together. And just imagine if they were all wildlife friendly, full of wildflowers and bees and butterflies and the like. That would really make a difference. And even better if we could get the local councils on board so that the road verges and the roundabouts were all full of flowers, and the parks and the cemeteries and every other bit of urban green space that isn't being used for anything much. That would make a national network of insect-friendly habitat, and that would really start to make a difference. And the exciting thing here is this is already kind of happening. There are lots of councils that have reduced mowing to encourage wildflowers. There are lots of gardeners planting wildflowers and bee-friendly plants and so on already. We just need to push it along, to accelerate it. And I get quite excited. Sorry, I've written some books about this. There are some books left if anyone wants to buy them at the end, but there's not many. But if you want to know more about what you can do in your garden, or you can look on, I've got loads of YouTube videos, do have a look about the best plants to grow for bees and so on. So, this is how not to do it. So although we think of gardening as a green activity, you know, what could be more green than growing flowers and vegetables and the like? A lady called Jenny Owen, who had a small garden, about 1/8 of an acre, right in Leicester, in an urban area, and she wrote a book, The Wildlife of a Garden, in which she described how over 35 years she catalogued every species she could find in her little urban garden, every plant, every insect, every bird that she spotted or whatever. Her species list, after 35 years of, I mean, top marks for dedication, was, if I remember correctly, 2,673 different species of animal and plant. Isn't that extraordinary? I mean, I wouldn't have thought 1/8 of an acre of rainforest would have so many species in it, let alone an urban garden in Leicester, which is not famous as a biodiversity hotspot. And of course, most of those were insects, 1,997, I think. So gardens can be really teeming with life if we just do a few things to encourage it. So what do we need to do? So I'm going to quickly run through some of the perhaps more obvious things, a few do's and don'ts to encourage wildlife. There's obviously a lot more to it than I can cover in the last 10 minutes of my talk. One thing to bear in mind is that generally speaking, native plants tend to be better than non-natives for wildlife. There's a number of studies that have looked at pollinators and the attraction of pollinating insects to native versus non-natives. This is one such study that I was involved in, which is open access. If you want to have a look, anyone can read it. And I worked with Rosie Rollins from a nursery, an organic nursery, and she did all the work, to be fair. She grew 111 different plant species or cultivars that are thought to be bee-friendly in experimental plots of all the same size, and for over 5 years she counted every insect that went to them. And one of her findings was that, on average, native plants attracted more pollinating insects than non-natives, which tallies with other studies. Kind of makes sense, because obviously our native pollinators co-evolved over thousands or perhaps millions of years with our native plants. But actually the difference isn't that great. There are lots of really good non-native plants that pollinators love. One of the very best is Phacelia, for example, which I grow in my garden, and bees absolutely love it, but it's from North America. But at the end of the day, things like bees, they don't really care where nectar comes from. It's just sweet water, as long as they can get to it and they can reach into the flower. So anyway, from a pollinator perspective, growing natives is slightly better than non-natives on average, with exceptions. But the real benefit, before I move on, let me just show you, from that trial I just mentioned, the 3 best performing natives for pollinators were marjoram and viper's bugloss and greater knapweed. All of them beautiful plants I could highly recommend you grow in your garden. But the real benefit of growing natives, sorry, am I running out of time? The real benefit of growing natives is when it comes to herbivorous insects, which tend to be much fussier about what they'll eat. So, for example, the caterpillars of butterflies and moths tend to only eat leaves of 1 or 2 species of plant. And they won't eat non-native plants very largely because they've not co-adapted with them. Leaves are usually defended with chemicals evolved over time by the plant, prevent insects and other herbivores from eating them. And insects have evolved to overcome those defenses, but they can only overcome the defenses of 1 or 2 types of plants. So they're very specialist in what they eat. So, for example, the orange-tip butterfly its caterpillars will only eat the leaves of a couple of species of crucifer, things like lady's smock and garlic mustard. If you grow those in your garden, there's a really good chance you'll get a breeding population of orange-tip butterflies. If you don't grow them, you definitely won't, because that's all its caterpillars will eat. And likewise, every native plant you add will feed more species of herbivorous insect, more moths, more butterflies, who knows what. So planting natives is definitely good. To take an extreme example, if you planted an oak tree, it could support hundreds of species of insect. If you plant a eucalyptus tree, basically support nothing. So natives are good, which kind of brings me to the subject of weeds. Now, many of us were sort of taught that these are undesirable plants that should be eradicated at all. You know, you're a bad gardener if your lawn is full of dandelions. That's what I remember my dad spending hours when I was a kid. He used to get me to try and dig out the roots, and many people spray them with herbicides. But these are all native wildflowers, thistles, ragwort. They're really popular with pollinators, among actually the most visited of our native plants by a whole range of pollinating insects. Dandelions are really good for bees in particular in early spring and so on. So I think we should try to be more tolerant of these species. I grow all of these in my garden. Ragwort looks really nice in a herbaceous border. I don't, thankfully, have a farm next door to shout at me for my seeds blowing over the fence. But anyway, you know, you can get rid of all the weeds in your garden just like that, just by calling them all wildflowers, because that's basically what they're. There's a really nice project. There's a lady called Sophie LeGill, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, in one of the London boroughs, who started a More Than Weeds campaign, where she surveyed the species of plants she could find growing in the cracks in the pavement in her London borough. And she found 47 different species of plant just growing in the cracks in the pavement. And then she's part of her project was to highlight this biodiversity that people just never noticed. They just literally walked on top of, by writing the names with chalk next to each plant species to kind of get passers-by to stop and pay attention to these cool little plants. I thought that was really sweet. Instead, of course, instead of encouraging all this urban biodiversity, sadly still, we often see things like this on the left here. That picture was taken in Dorset. You can probably, all of you, recognise what you're looking at here. That was a little bit of life, a bit of greenery growing around a tree. Probably not terribly biodiverse, but there may have been a few insects in there too. Now it's dead. It's been sprayed with herbicide, almost certainly Roundup. Many councils employ teams of people, literally, to drive the streets looking for anything green, and if they see it, they'll jump out the car and kill it with a herbicide. I don't really understand the necessity for that. I mean, surely that doesn't look nice. It would have surely been nicer when it was alive. It seems like just mindless environmental vandalism to do that, as well as being a waste of taxpayers' money and resources. And there's a sinister side to this as well, which is that, I mentioned it, Roundup, which is the most commonly used pesticide in the world. Its active ingredient is glyphosate. The World Health Organization declared a few years ago that this is a probable carcinogen. There's pretty good evidence that exposure to it increases the likelihood of your getting non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. It's disputed, the evidence, by the manufacturers. There's a surprise. But nonetheless, if the World Health Organization says it's a carcinogen, or a probable carcinogen, maybe it's not the best stuff to spray in our streets. I've even seen pictures of it being sprayed all over children's play equipment in the local park. That just seems absolutely bonkers to me. I think we should just ban pesticides from urban areas completely. There's no need for them in your garden. I garden without any pesticides. I've got a 2-acre garden, and it's absolutely fine. There are loads of ways of doing without them. You can argue, or you can try to argue, that pesticides may be essential in farming. I would argue with that, but they're not essential in gardens, and I can say that categorically because in France they banned pesticides from use in urban areas. In 2018, they introduced a law that only licensed farmers are now able to buy pesticides, so all gardens, all parks, all streets in Paris, in every French city, are pesticide-free. And Paris hasn't been overrun with giant cockroaches and killer dandelions or whatever. It's still absolutely fine. So if Paris can be pesticide-free, why can't Lincoln? Why can't London? It seems to me. It would be a really easy win. You may not use pesticides yourself. I wouldn't be surprised if many of you garden organically. But beware, there are other ways you can accidentally poison the bees in your garden. I touched on this a minute ago, but we published a study recently where we bought plants being sold by big name garden centres, and we specifically bought ones with the RHS's Perfect for Pollinator logo on them, plants that are attractive to bees and butterflies, or other bee-friendly logos. And we tested them for pesticides, and you'll not be surprised by what I'm going to tell you, but basically nearly every plant had been treated with at least one pesticide. One of them had been treated with a little heather plant, had 10 different pesticides in it. I have no idea why that was necessary to keep alive a small heather plant, which is pretty tough stuff. But anyway, 75% of these bee-friendly plants contained insecticides. Surely that breaches some kind of trade's descriptions or something. So beware, at least, you know, there's plants that they look so beautiful, and it's so tempting to spend a fortune in the garden centre. But they look beautiful for the same reason that much of the fruit and veg looks beautiful in the supermarket. It doesn't come about, it doesn't look so beautiful for natural reasons, shall we say. Anyway, one other way you might accidentally poison the wildlife in your local area is this one, which very few people know about as yet. It's become a bit of a personal mission to raise awareness of this. I've got a PhD student studying this issue at the moment. So you've probably all heard of, or many of you will have heard of neonicotinoid insecticides, which were banned in farming because of the evidence that they are poisoning bees and other insects. But oddly enough, you can still buy the same stuff, a neonicotinoid insecticide, to drip on the neck of your dog, and your vet will encourage you to do so. So these products are both neurotoxic insecticides that are toxic to insects in tiny doses. Your vet will encourage you to use these prophylactically on your dog or cat. So I had the experience of taking my dog in. She had a thorn in her paw, and I took her into, well, it was a bit more than a thorn, but anyway, I took her to the vet, and he fixed the thorn and then tried to sell me a flea treatment. She didn't have any fleas, she'd never had fleas, but he tried to sell it me anyway and tried to sign me up for a healthcare plan for a monthly treatment of this and some other drugs as well. The dose you're supposed to put on a medium-sized dog of this product Advocate on the left here, supposed to drip on its neck once a month, is enough to kill 60 million honeybees. And this stuff is really persistent in the environment. It's water-soluble, so if your dog gets wet, particularly if it jumps in the local canal, that's a huge dose of insecticide going into that freshwater system. We just recently published a paper where we found that 100% of English rivers are contaminated with one, or in most cases both, of these flea treatment insecticides being used on our dogs and cats. So do beware. Okay, I should probably wrap up in a minute. There's just a couple more things I'll talk about briefly. Okay, so we'll leave the pesticide depressing stuff behind and move on to some easy wins. Firstly, reduce mowing. This is so easy. Why are we obsessed with stripy lawns that we mow every fortnight, trying to recreate a Wimbledon tennis court in our gardens? It's kind of nuts. It uses petrol, it's a waste of time. If you leave a lawn, but that's my lawn, and it just came into flower as soon as we stopped mowing. So next time you start to twitch and think the lawn is too long, if you can just restrain yourself and instead of getting the mower out of the shed, get a deck chair and make yourself a gin and tonic and sit down and chill. It's a much better way to spend your time. Likewise, we don't need to have mown road verges. There are loads of amenity grasslands that could be full of flowers, like this road verge here. Just imagine if every road verge and every roundabout was full of wildflowers. Which kind of brings me to sowing seed mixes. So that's primarily an annual seed mix, and it's commonly used. There are lots of different wildflower seed mixes available, and it's really confusing. I think a lot of people don't know quite what are the best ones to sow. So I thought it'd be worth just very quickly telling you a little bit about what I think, anyway. There are broadly 3 types of wildflower seed mixes commonly available from manufacturers in this country. This is one category. They're sometimes called Pictorial Meadows. They look really pretty. They're full of annual plants that flower in the first year. They do attract pollinators, but they're sold very often as wildflowers, but these are mostly not native plants. They're from North America, from China, from all over the place. I guess they're wild somewhere, but surely the word wildflower implies native to me, and these aren't. And so they will feed some bees, but they won't feed all the herbivorous insects that I mentioned that won't eat the leaves of these non-native plants, or mostly non-natives anyway. So I think these maybe have a role in urban areas if you want a lot of colour quickly, but are not ideal from a wildlife perspective, so beware. Then the second kind of group, you've got these mixes, this is similar to the one on the road verge I showed a second ago, these are cornfield annuals, poppies, cornflowers, corn marigolds, corn cockle and so on. It used to grow in cornfields, in arable fields, but don't really survive with modern herbicide usage and modern farming practices. Some people argue that these aren't native, but that they were brought in by Neolithic people about 4,000 years ago. To me, that's getting a bit pedantic. I think they've been here for 4,000 years. Maybe we could give them the benefit of the doubt, so these are quite pretty and native, but they will disappear after 1 year and need sowing every year. I think if we're sowing wildflowers, we primarily should be sowing this kind of thing, a perennial wildflower mix, to try and restore or recreate some of the beautiful natural wildflower meadows that we used to have tons of. This is a really rare habitat now in Britain. We destroyed 97% of our perennial wildflower meadows in the 20th century. And this is a habitat that's brilliant for pollinators and brilliant for loads of other wildlife as well. So if you're going to sow a wildflower seed mix, I think aim for something along these lines. Okay, to wrap up, finally you might think, I think we kind of need to try and rewild ourselves a bit if we can. You know, we've become so used to trying to kill and control anything that's the tiniest bit inconvenient to us. And I think we need to somehow break away from that and try to learn to respect the rest of life on our planet and at least give it some, stop thinking of ourselves as being all important and allow space for the rest of life on Earth to survive, as I mentioned when I was talking about earwigs earlier. You know, we don't often stop to think about it, but we live on this rock hurtling through space. It's absurd, really. It's unbelievable. And there's a little crust of life clinging to its surface. This is our home. It's all we have. Whatever Elon Musk tells you, we are not going to be going to live on Mars anytime soon. So we should be really looking after what we have. And we're not doing a great job to date. But we have to do better. And what better place to start than by looking after the little insects that live all around us. Thank you, everybody, for bearing with me.